In this episode, you're going to master working with arrays, which is the most common data structure in computer programming. Every programming language includes some form of an array, and in this video, I'm going to demonstrate arrays using JavaScript. You use arrays when it makes sense to store a list of values in a single variable. For example, imagine you tracked your body weight for the last 10 days, and now you want to write a simple program to just print out all the body weight data that you collected. You have the choice of creating 10 variables to store each body weight, or you can choose to store all the body weight data in a single array variable. This is a very simple example, but imagine that instead of the last 10 days, you had collected your body weight data for a year. Does it make sense to create 365 variables to store each body weight? It sure doesn't. Your code will be much cleaner, less error prone, and more efficient if it can deal with a single variable that contains all the body weight data instead. In the example on the right, you can already see how simple it is to create an array in JavaScript. But let's look at creating arrays in more detail. In JavaScript, the simplest way to create an array is by using the bracket operator. Another way to create an array is by using the array constructor. In both cases, when you create an array in this manner, you're creating an array with no elements. To create an array and initialize it with a set of elements at the same time, all you have to do is provide a comma-separated list of values inside the bracket operator or inside the array constructor. When using the array constructor, there is one particular thing you should remember. When multiple values are passed to the constructor, the array gets created and initialized with those values. But if you pass in just a single integer as an argument, then what gets created is an empty array, and the single integer argument is used to set the initial size of the empty array instead. In JavaScript, the most common, preferred, and efficient way of creating arrays is by using the bracket operator. So that's what I'll use in the examples going forward. Let's create an array called geodata to store the name of a place along with its latitude and longitude information. Notice how the name of the place is a string data type, while the latitude and longitude are numbers. In JavaScript, the arrays you create are allowed to have elements with different data types. This is contrary to other programming languages such as Java, for example, where the elements of an array must all be the same data type. While we're still on the topic of creating arrays, you should know that you can think of words and sentences as arrays. A word is simply an array of characters, and a sentence is an array of words. The string data type in JavaScript provides the split function to convert a string to an array. Here we have a string variable called sentence, and it's set to the value, "Please subscribe to my YouTube channel." This sentence can be viewed as an array with 6 word elements, where each word is separated by a space. So to create the array, you call the split function on the string variable and provide a blank space character as an argument. The split function takes the argument and uses it as a common delimiter to break the string up into word elements for the array. You can also call the split function on a word to split it into characters. The delimiter to break a word into characters is a pair of quotes with no space. Alright, so with the split function, we can turn strings into arrays. And if you want to do the opposite by turning arrays into strings, you can using the join and the toString function. Here we have an array of 7 elements made up mostly of strings and 1 number. We use the join function to take the elements of the array and convert it to a string called sentence1. By default, when no argument is passed to the join function, it combines the elements of the array into a string using a comma. For sentence 2, we're passing a blank space character to the join function, so it combines the array elements using spaces. So sentence 2 appears as a normal looking sentence. For sentence 3, we're passing a plus as an argument, and so you can see the string is created by combining the elements with a plus sign. And for the last sentence, instead of using join, we use the toString function to get the string representation of the array. The toString function doesn't take any argument, so the only way it creates a string from an array is by combining the elements using a comma. This is similar to using the join function without any argument. Next, let's look at accessing and writing array elements. To access an element in the array, you provide the index inside the bracket operator. In this case, hero1 variable gets assigned the value Iron Man, and hero2 is equal to Thor. If you want to insert or override an element in an array, let's say you want to replace the third element Hulk with Black Widow, then you can simply access the third element and set it equal to the value Black Widow. Looking at the Marvel Heroes list again, let's say you want to add Doctor Strange to the end of the array. You can do so like this, making use of the array's length property, but it's more intuitive to use the push function. With the push function, you don't have to provide any index information. JavaScript simply takes care of adding the element to the end of the array. Now let's say you want to add Ant-Man to the front of the array. You can do so by using the unshift function. Adding a new element to the front of the array requires moving all the existing elements to the right to make space for the insertion. This part is handled automatically by JavaScript, and you don't have to write any additional code for moving the elements. Now, instead of adding element to the back or front, if you just want to remove the first or last element, you can use the pop and shift function to do so. The pop function removes the last element, and the shift function removes the first element. Both pop and shift functions return the value of the element removed, whereas the push and unshift functions return the length of the array after adding the element. JavaScript arrays also provide a function called splice to add and remove elements at the same time. The splice function can take 3 arguments. The first argument you pass is the start index, then how many elements to remove, and finally a list of values you want to add. Only the first argument, the start index, is mandatory. Let's go ahead and see it in action. Here we have an array called numbers. Let's use the splice function to insert 4, 5, and 6 right after the 3 in the array. The element right after 3 is 7, which is at index 3. So let's set the start index to 3. In this example, we're only interested in adding numbers, so the number of elements to remove is 0. And finally, we're passing in 4, 5, 6, which is the list of values we want to add. Now you can see the numbers array contains 4, 5, 6 right after 3. Now let's say you want to remove the first 2 elements from the array. So you use the splice function and set the start index to 0, and specify 2 as the number of elements to remove. With this, you have the first 2 elements removed from the array. Finally, let's look at an example of removing and adding elements at the same time. What we're going to do is remove 6 and 7 and replace it with 60 and 70. 6 starts at index 3, so for the splice function, the first argument will be the index 3. For the second argument, we want to remove 2 elements, 6 and 7, and the element we want to add are 60 and 70. Now you can see that we correctly removed 6 and 7 and added 60 and 70. Now let's look at searching for a value in an array. If you want to see if Spider-Man is in the Marvel Heroes list, then pass the value Spider-Man to the index of function. If Spider-Man is found in the array, then the function will return the index where the value is found. If it doesn't find Spider-Man, then the index of function returns a -1. It's important to note that the index of function returns the index of the first occurrence of where the value is found. If there are multiple occurrences of Spider-Man in the Marvel Heroes list, then the index of the element where Spider-Man is encountered first will be returned. If you're more interested in finding the position of the last occurrence of a value, then you can use the last index of function, which will return the index 4. Finally, if you just want to know if a specific value exists in an array and not really care about the index where a value is found, then you can use the includes method on an array. To use includes on an array, you pass in the value you're searching for. Just note that includes performs a case-sensitive search, and there's also an optional second parameter to instruct which index the search should begin from. In this case, when we search for the value Spider-Man, the operation returns a value of true. When we search for a value that doesn't exist, what is returned is false. Moving on, let's look at creating new arrays from existing arrays using Concat. The Concat function creates a brand new array by combining 2 or more arrays together. You use concat on an existing array and pass another array to the function as an argument. The array you pass in gets appended to the end of the array calling the concat function. Here the numbers array is calling concat, so the new array created will contain the elements from the numbers array first and then the elements from the letters array. In this example, the letters array is calling concat. So the new array will contain the elements from the letters array first, and then the elements from the numbers array. You can also use the slice function to create arrays from existing arrays. More specifically, you use the slice function to create a new array by copying a portion of an existing array. The slice function accepts two optional parameters called start and end. Start and end establish the range of indexes to copy from the array. Here we have an array called superheroes that calls the slice function without any arguments passed in. So what you get is simply a full copy of superheroes array. Next, the slice function is used with only a start index of 3 as an argument. When no end index is provided, slice will simply copy all the elements from the start index. So the new array created here will only contain Wolverine and Hulk. Finally, in this example, the slice function is used with a start index of 0 and an end index of 3. This means slice will copy Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman to create the new array. It's important to note that at index 3, we have the element Wolverine, but it's not included in the array because slice only copies up to the end index. It does not include the end index when copying. Next, let's look at iterating through arrays. Iterating through an array means accessing each element of an array one by one. Here is an example of iterating through an array using a for loop. In order to access each element of the array, you have to start at index 0. Then you control the number of times the body of the for loop executes by making use of the array's length property. The loop executes as long as the value of the current index is less than the length of the array. And every time the loop executes, the index is increased by 1 to move to the next index. So ultimately, you end up at the last index of the array, and the loop breaks after because the condition becomes false. Similarly, you can iterate using a while loop. The condition for the while loop is the same as the for loop. The difference is that the index is initialized before the loop and the value of the index is incremented in the body instead. In both cases, the output is exactly the same. Let's iterate the Marvel Heroes list again, but this time using forIn and forOf statement. When iterating arrays using forIn, you automatically have access to the current index. So you can also get access to the value by providing the index to the bracket operator. So the output here looks like this. When using forOf statement to iterate, you get access to the value instead of the index. So the output here would look like this. However, if you really wanted to get access to the index using forOf, you can simply call the keys method on the Marvel Heroes list array. This gives you access to the index, and then you can get the value again using the index, and what you have is the same output as before. And finally, if you wanted access to the index and value at the same time, you can call the entries method on the array and use destructuring to get access to both. In addition to using loops to iterate arrays, you can also use what are known as functional array methods. The first one we'll look at is forEach. The forEach method accepts a function as an argument, and it simply calls this function for each element in an array. Here we have an array of numbers, and we're calling forEach by passing the function showDouble as an argument. The forEach method passes the current array element as an argument to the showDouble function as it executes each time. The showDouble function receives the current array element and it simply multiplies it by 2, then prints it to the console. Since this is done for each element in the array, you get the following output. Just one more thing to note is that since forEach accepts a function, we could also just pass the function inline, as in this case, using an arrow function. The next functional array method we'll look at is the map method. The map method creates and returns a new array by calling the function you provide on each element of an array. So here we have an array of domain names. Let's say we want to create a new array called URLs by adding the string https://www to the front of every domain name. To do so, we create a new variable called URLs and set it to the value returned by the map method. The map method takes the function we provide and executes it for each element in the array. And the result returned each time is what makes up the elements of the array we are creating. So the URLs array that we created looks like this. Next, let's look at the filter method. Here we have an array of numbers 1 through 10. The filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the function we provide. This function implements a test to check if a given element is an even number. The test is to simply check if the remainder after dividing the current element by 2 is 0. So only 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 is available in the even numbers array because the function provided returns true only for these elements in the array. There are more functional array methods to explore, but the last one we'll look at is the reduce method. The reduce method executes a reducer callback function on each element of an array. The purpose of running a reducer function sequentially on all the elements is to ultimately produce a single value. For example, here we have an array of numbers 1 through 4. If we want to calculate the sum of all the elements in the array, we can do so in various ways, but I'll demonstrate this using the reduce method. When using the reduce method, the reducer function you provide has access to the previous value, the current index, and the entire array during each iteration. The previous value is the result of what is returned after executing the reducer function in the previous iteration. The current value represents the element during the current iteration. The current index is self-explanatory, and the array is the reference to the entire array we're iterating on using the reduce method. You can also supply the reduce method with a second argument known as the initial value. To calculate the sum of all the elements in the array, we'll just supply a reducer function using the previous and current value and an initial value of 0 as the second argument to the reduce method. When the reduce method executes, during its first iteration, there is no previous value, so it uses the initial value of 0 as the previous value. The current value is set to 1, so the reducer function returns a value of 0 plus 1, which is just 1. During the second iteration, the previous value is now set to 1, which is what was returned by the reducer function in the previous iteration. The current value is now set to 2, so the reducer function during the second iteration returns 1 plus 2, which is 3. During the third iteration, the previous value is set to 3, and the current element is also 3, so the reducer function returns 3 plus 3, which is 6. Finally, during the fourth iteration, the previous value is now set to 6, and the current value is set to 4. So the reducer function after its final iteration returns the value 6 plus 4, which is 10. So the total sum of all the elements in the array is 10. Before I wrap up this episode, you should know that what we covered so far is a good chunk of knowledge for working with arrays in JavaScript. However, for a full reference on arrays, my advice would be for you to go check out the documentation provided by Mozilla. And so to finally end this video, let's look at one last topic on arrays, which is how to create and process multidimensional arrays. JavaScript doesn't provide a built-in data structure for multidimensional arrays. Natively, JavaScript arrays are one-dimensional. However, you can still create multidimensional arrays by creating arrays where the elements are also arrays. As an example, let's create a two-dimensional array. You can visualize 2D arrays as a matrix of rows and columns. This matrix has 3 rows and 3 columns, so it's a 3 by 3 matrix. We can create this easily by creating an array of 3 elements where each element is also an array of 3 elements. It's important to note that in JavaScript, it's not necessary for all the rows to have the same number of elements. This row here could have 3 elements, this row here could have 5 elements, and this row here could have 1 element. If the rows in an array have different number of elements, the array is referred to as a jagged array. With that bit of information out of the way, let's look at accessing elements from this 2D array. You can access any element by using the array variable along with two bracket operators. In the first bracket, you provide the row, and in the second bracket, you provide the column of the element you want to access. So let's say you want to access the following elements: 2, 6, and 7. 2 is in row 0 and column 1, so executing this statement returns the element 2. 6 is at row 1 and column 2, so you can execute this statement to get 6. And finally, 7 is at row 2 and column 0, so executing this statement we get 7.